Hello everyone. So today I'm going to talk about the killing of Trayvon Martin by George Zimmerman, but I feel like I need to explain myself and justify this a little before we get going here. It'd be fair to ask, why now, 5 years later, do you want to talk about this? And the answer there is that I still believe it to be relevant. The generalities of the incident, a black person, in this case Trayvon Martin, is killed by a white person, in this case George Zimmerman, in unclear or ambiguous circumstances, and then later the killer receives either no or relatively little legal punishment. The names and the locations change, but the general outline remains the same. And the feeling held by a lot of black people and more racially conscious people of other races is that these people probably would not have been killed had they been white, or if they had still been killed, the justice system would have treated the killers much less leniently. And this can be a hard thing to prove. We're talking about certain likelihoods and probabilities, subconscious or otherwise hidden biases, and we don't have another America in which Trayvon Martin was a white teenager walking home from the store to see what would have happened differently were that the case. It's also easy to examine only the particulars of each incident in isolation, and therefore avoid considering the overall trends. Each case is easy to excuse if you're looking for excuses. Trayvon Martin hit George Zimmerman, so Zimmerman was justified in defending himself. Tamir Rice had a toy gun, and that could have been mistaken for a real gun, so, therefore, etc. There's always an excuse, however valid that excuse is, with the cases that receive a lot of media attention. A useful comparison here is the shooting of Levar Edward Jones. Now, this shooting was not a particularly high-profile case. A Google search for Levar Edward Jones only gives 1,300 results compared to the 1.6 million for Trayvon Martin, for instance. And I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of people hadn't heard of this shooting. So, a very brief overview then. On September the 4th of 2014, South Carolina State Trooper Shaun pulled up behind Levar Edward Jones as he exited his vehicle at a gas station. Grubert asked Jones to get his license and registration, and when Jones reached for them, Grubert panicked and pulled his gun and fired several times, hitting Jones in the hip. Now, I'll link the video in the description and avoid showing it here, but it's pretty much as I described. So why didn't this case get as much media attention as some others? Well, there's a few factors, and they're all rather depressing to think about, to be honest. The first is that there is a clear record of the incident. It happened in plain sight in view of Grubert's dash cam. The second is that the person who was shot survived and could thus later argue their case. And the third is that Grubert was very quickly fired, arrested, and charged with felony assault and battery, so there's very little to argue about this case. It's clear cut. The person who was shot was entirely innocent, the police officer was clearly in the wrong, and that's the end of that. There's no excuse for that one. And that's the important thing here, there not being an excuse or a justification. But let's imagine an alternate version of the shooting of Levar Edward Jones. What if the gunshot had been fatal, and the person who was shot wasn't around to tell his side of the story? And what if the dash cam had been angled slightly differently, or didn't pick up the incident, or alternatively, what if the dash cam footage had been not so mysteriously lost? Well, then the officer in this imaginary case could have then said anything he liked to justify the shooting. He looked dangerous, he said he was going to kill me, he grabbed for my gun, whatever, and there's the justification. Now, we see that blame is always individualized in these sorts of incidents. The black person who was shot or killed is always considered at fault, up until it's an obvious and unavoidable fact that they were innocent. Now, completely absent from this framework are societal factors or racial biases or any sort of wider consideration of trends. Only one person can be at fault. It's either the person who was shot or the person who did the shooting, and that's the end of that. And so we come to the point of my video. This video is aimed at people who might, subconsciously even, reach for the easy excuse to justify these kinds of incidents. Now, I don't think these people are capital R racists necessarily, just that they might be harbouring some biases that can be exposed with a little effort and a bit of deeper thinking about the topic. And we're going to examine one case in particular, the shooting of Trayvon Martin. We're going to look at the various justifications given for Zimmerman's actions and see if they hold water, and then afterwards I've come up with a clever way, if I do say so myself, of proving that bias exists in reactions to cases like this. So stick about if you want to see that. My intention here is that by getting people to stop and think about just one case, they might not be so quick to jump to conclusions for similar cases. My hope is that this video can be linked to people who might try to excuse the actions of George Zimmerman, and hopefully they'll sit through it and maybe take a few points on board. So okay, I'll start out here by giving an as neutral as possible account of the incident. On February 26th, 2012, Trayvon Martin, who was visiting family at the retreat at Twin Lakes in Sanford, Florida, walked to a local store at about 7 p.m. On his return from the store, he was spotted by George Zimmerman, the organizer of the local neighborhood watch, who mistook him for a criminal and called the police. Zimmerman described Martin as looking as if he was up to no good and possibly on drugs. After observing Martin for a time, Zimmerman left his vehicle to continue to follow him when he moved out of sight. This was followed by the police dispatcher asking Zimmerman if he was following Martin, to which Zimmerman replied that he was. The dispatcher then asked him not to do that. Zimmerman was also armed with a 9mm handgun for which he had a concealed carry permit. After being unable to locate Martin, Zimmerman ended his call with the police dispatcher, instructing them to call him back when an officer arrived on the scene. Shortly after ending the call, Zimmerman and Martin met at the top of the T-shaped intersection between the rows of houses. A physical altercation ensued, during which Zimmerman received a nosebleed and some light abrasive wounds to the back of his head, and Trayvon Martin was shot fatally in the chest. Police arrived on the scene shortly thereafter. So that's the basic outline of the events, containing only the facts that are beyond dispute. Of course, quite a few other things happened, or probably happened, but those need to be talked about in more detail. So what do we think about this incident? Well, let me start by saying that I agree with Zimmerman being found not guilty at trial. Now, that is not because I do not believe him to be at fault, because he was. He definitely was. But I believe he was overcharged. Zimmerman was charged with second-degree murder, which requires the prosecution to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Zimmerman intended to kill Trayvon Martin. And without an eyewitness to the start of the physical altercation, as we'll see, that is impossible to prove in court. The start of the altercation is what is important here. You see, the first justification for the shooting of Trayvon Martin is that he injured Zimmerman, and therefore Zimmerman could have reasonably feared for his life and thus was in the clear to defend himself. Now, the problem with this argument is that that same justification for Zimmerman's actions also works in reverse. Trayvon Martin was also injured. Much worse than Zimmerman, he was fatally injured, and therefore, by the same logic, he was legally in the clear to kill Zimmerman in self-defense as well. So we're in a weird legal limbo here. It certainly can't be the case that two people are just legally allowed to fight to the death because they both fear for their own lives. So what matters here is who initiated the physical altercation. Without knowing that, Zimmerman's injuries could have been inflicted by Trayvon Martin acting legally in self-defense. And a lot of people who were outraged by this case probably thought with some justification that a stranger following you at night and chasing you down a dark alley was itself enough to justify defending yourself physically. As for actual hard courtroom evidence though, we have relatively little to go on. We have Zimmerman's account of the incident, told through his written statement, his interviews with the police, and a recorded walkthrough of the event conducted the following day. But that is obviously not reliable by itself for what I hope are obvious reasons. Also, Zimmerman provably lies at several times during his recounting of the incident, which we'll get to shortly. So, without a witness to or recording of Zimmerman starting the fight, and with no other indication that Zimmerman actually wanted to kill Martin, there isn't really enough here for a murder conviction. What you can prove is that Zimmerman was in the wrong at several points. He was incorrect in his profiling of Martin as a criminal. He was incorrect to leave his vehicle to pursue Martin. He at several times acted recklessly and idiotically. but that doesn't prove he actually wanted to murder Trayvon Martin. And indeed, if we read the Sanford Police Department's report after they eventually decided to recommend charging Zimmerman with something, they said there is probable cause for charging Zimmerman with manslaughter, stating, "The encounter between George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin was ultimately avoidable by Zimmerman if he had remained in his vehicle and awaited the arrival of law enforcement, or conversely if he'd identified himself to Martin as a concerned citizen and initiated dialogue in an effort to dispel each party's concerns. There is no indication that Trayvon Martin was involved in any criminal activity at the time of the encounter." And yes, the prosecutors would have had a much easier time proving manslaughter in court, mainly because of all the aforementioned lies that Zimmerman can be shown to have told. So let's talk about some of those, and also examine another anti-Trayvon Martin argument, this one being that during the time Zimmerman was on the phone, Trayvon Martin had enough time to get home to safety. And people generally use this fact to suggest that since Trayvon Martin did not return home immediately, he was therefore looking to ambush or otherwise confront Zimmerman. Now, one can come up with several possible scenarios for why Martin did not return home immediately. Firstly, he was on the phone to a friend at the time, so maybe he simply wanted to finish his conversation before reaching the house, and so he paused early. Secondly, maybe he was sufficiently freaked out by the strange guy who was following him around and decided that leading that person to his house might be a bad idea. Remember, Martin had no clue who Zimmerman was or why he was following him, so that is another possible scenario. These possibilities, though, are actually entirely unnecessary. Let's go with the idea that Trayvon Martin did hide or even walked all the way home before changing his mind and deciding he was going to confront Zimmerman. So he marched right back up the path with the intention of doing just that. Now, the problem here is that confront does not mean attack, and it certainly does not mean kill. Martin does not know what's going on, remember. He doesn't know that the police have been called, or that Zimmerman has a gun, or that he's about to be shot with it. He's under no legal responsibility to do anything in particular so long as he does not break the law. He does not have to return home. He can walk up and down the street all night if he likes, and there's nothing illegal about approaching someone to ask why they're following you. Criticizing Martin for not returning home immediately is cynically placing the blame on him for not anticipating and avoiding his own killing. Even if Martin did double back to confront Zimmerman, that still tells us nothing about who initiated the physical confrontation. Secondly here, this criticism of Martin's actions also applies equally, or even more so, to Zimmerman. The top of the T intersection is much closer to where Zimmerman's truck was parked than where Trayvon Martin's house was, and Zimmerman had the exact same amount of time to get back to his truck if that's what he wished to do. If you're going to criticize Trayvon Martin for still being present when Zimmerman got off the phone, then you have to apply that criticism to Zimmerman also. Unlike Martin, however, Zimmerman is still around to inform us why he was still in the alley between the houses instead of back at his truck, and his explanation for still being there, as it turns out, makes no sense whatsoever. Firstly, let's go through the transcript of Zimmerman's call to the police and highlight all the relevant information. Then we'll look at Zimmerman's walkthrough of the events the next day and compare the two accounts. So the relevant parts of the police call are as follows. Firstly, Zimmerman gives the dispatcher the address of the clubhouse at Retreat View Circle. Then later in the call, he gives the more precise location of his truck. Go straight past the clubhouse, make a left, and then past the mailboxes. That's where his truck was. Then the dispatcher asks what address Zimmerman is parked in front of. One time. And Zimmerman responds that he does not know. And at the end of the call, the following exchange takes place. The dispatcher asks Zimmerman if he wants to meet the police near the mailboxes where his truck is, and Zimmerman agrees at first. But then when the dispatcher attempts to confirm this meeting place, Zimmerman changes his mind and says, "Actually, could you have them call me and I'll tell them where I'm at," indicating that he was not planning to be where his truck currently was. Now let's look at the recording of Zimmerman's reenactment to the incident for the police, because there are a few key points where his account differs here.
And still looking around at the houses and stuff, so then the dispatcher said, where did he go? What direction did he go in? And I said, I don't know. I lost, because he cut down here and made a right. I guess it's Twin Trees Lane. He made a right in there. And they said, well, what direction did he go in? And I said, I don't know. I can't see him.
Okay.
And they said, can you get to somewhere where you can see him? And I said, yeah, I can. So I backed out.
This interaction, where the dispatcher asks Zimmerman if he can get to somewhere he can see Trayvon Martin, is not in the transcript, and is likely a later embellishment by Zimmerman to justify his continued following of Martin in his truck.
Yes, and I saw him standing right about here. And I saw him walking back that way and then cut through the back of the houses. He looked back and he noticed me and he cut back through the houses. I was still on the phone with non-emergency.
Mm-hmm.
And then he came back and he started walking up towards the grass and then came down and circled my car. And I told the operator that. He was circling my car. I didn't hear if he said anything.
Right.
But he had his hand in his waistband.
This interaction, where Zimmerman observes Martin circle his truck and informs the operator about it, is not present in the transcript. Zimmerman does mention that Martin is looking at him at one point, but at no point mentions Martin circle the truck. It's unlikely that Martin would have had enough time to do this in the brief time in the call before Zimmerman left his truck, and also unlikely Zimmerman would not have mentioned it to the dispatcher. This is likely a later embellishment in order to make Martin appear more threatening.
And I think I told the operator that, and they said, where are you? And I could not remember the name of the street, because I don't live on this street.
Right.
Retreat View Circle goes in a circle.
Right.
And I said, I don't know. And he goes, we need an address. And I said, I don't know an address. I think I gave them my address. And they said, give us directions to get to you. And I said, if you tell the police to go straight at the clubhouse and make a left, my truck will be there. And again, they asked me where he went, what direction he went in. And I said, I don't know. And then I thought to get out and look for a street sign.
Right.
So I got out of my car and I started walking.
Right. Go ahead.
Oh. I was still on the phone with non-emergency and I started walking.
Okay.
Down this way. And because I didn't see a street sign here, but I knew if I went straight through that's Retreat View Circle, and I could give him an address, because he said, just give me the address of the house you're in front of.
Okay.
And there's no address, because these are the back of the houses. So I walked straight through here.
Firstly, the dispatcher does not repeatedly ask for an address in the transcript. This is a fabrication by Zimmerman in order to create a pretext for him to leave the car. Secondly, his described actions here make no sense. I mean, we're first expected to believe that a man who has lived in the neighbourhood for several years and is the self-appointed head of the neighbourhood watch can't remember what street he's on in a neighbourhood with 3 streets. That seems rather unlikely to me, but whatever. Next up, Zimmerman is parked on Twin Trees Lane and claims he can't give an address because he's at the back of the houses. But as he's saying this, we can see behind him some houses which do face onto Twin Trees Lane, so his claim that he has to walk through to Retreat View Circle in order to find an address is clearly incorrect. He could just look at the much closer houses that do actually face onto Twin Trees Lane.
So that's when I walked straight through here to get the address so that I could meet the police officer. And then they said, I said, he's not here. They said, do you still want him to come? And I said, yes. And they said, where do you want him to come to? And I said, you know what, just tell him to meet me at my truck next to the clubhouse. If he goes straight into the clubhouse and makes a left, I have a Honda Ridgeline, silver Honda Ridgeline parked right there. I'll meet him right there. So I started walking back.
This interaction, in which Zimmerman informs the dispatcher that he wants to meet the police by his truck, is the actual opposite of what appears in the transcript. The dispatcher is the one to suggest that, and Zimmerman instead proposes them calling him back to see where he is. This lie is also repeated in one of the police interviews, where Zimmerman claims the dispatcher asked where he wanted to meet the police, and he said, at his car. So what does all this add up to? Well, I think it's fairly clear that all this rubbish about needing to find an address is an obvious fabrication. The dispatcher already had an address they were directing police to, and at no point asked Zimmerman to go walking to find another one. And even if they had done that, there were much closer addresses available for Zimmerman to go and check. And even if Zimmerman had needed to walk through to Retreat View Circle, he lived on Retreat View Circle, and I simply refuse to believe that he forgot the name of his own street and needed to go and physically look at a street sign to see where he was. Now, the probable truth is simply that Zimmerman was still looking for Trayvon Martin, intending to be the hero and catch the bad guy because, quote, these assholes always get away. Now, Zimmerman also tells several lies relating to the initial confrontation between him and Martin, and let's take a look at those. Firstly, there is a major discrepancy in Zimmerman's story about the location where he was knocked down by Martin. From his written statement, he says, "As I headed back to my vehicle, the suspect emerged from the darkness and said, 'You got a problem?' I said, 'No.' The suspect said, 'You do now.' As I looked and tried to find my phone to dial 911, the suspect punched me in the face. I fell backwards onto my back. The suspect got on top of me." So Zimmerman here makes it sound as if he was immediately dropped by the first punch, and this is echoed in his interview with the police. "He punched me in the nose. At that point, I fell down. Were you still standing at this point? No, ma'am. Okay. I fell to the ground when he punched me the first time." So that's Zimmerman restating and confirming that he fell at the first hit. And here's why this makes no sense. If Zimmerman really was walking back to his truck from Retreat View Circle, where he was apparently looking for a street sign to tell him what the name of the street he lived on was called, if he was doing that, he would only need to walk across the top of the T intersection to get back to the truck. Now, the problem with this account is that Martin's body was found a few houses down the path between the buildings. Here's a photograph taken from around the location where Zimmerman first claimed he fell to the ground, showing Martin's body in the distance. So what does this mean? Well, either Zimmerman's story about meeting Trayvon at the top of the intersection is untrue, and he was actually punched to the ground 40 feet down the path between the buildings with no explanation of why he should be there, or his story about being dropped with the first punch is untrue, because if he'd fell to the ground at the top of the intersection, then Trayvon Martin's body being found a few houses down the path makes no sense. And let's watch Zimmerman realise, in real time, that this aspect of his story is a load of old crap.
He was about there, but he was walking towards me.
Which direction here?
Yes, sir. I believe, like I said, I was already past that, so I didn't see exactly where he came from, but he was about where you were.
Okay.
And I said, no, I don't have a problem. And I went to go grab my cell phone, but I left it in a different pocket. And I looked down in my pant pocket, and he said, "You got a problem now." And then he was here, and he punched me in the face.
Right here?
Right up around here.
Okay.
To be honest with
That's
you,
fine.
I don't remember exactly.
That's fine.
I think I stumbled, and I fell down. He pushed me down. Somehow he got on top of me.
On the grass or on the snow?
It was more over towards here. I think I was trying to push him away from me, and then he got on top of me somewhere around here. And
Now, all of this trying to push him away from me while moving down the path stuff is completely absent from any of Zimmerman's earlier accounts of the incident and is also a bit suspect by itself. If Zimmerman was trying to escape, why didn't he go to the lit street where his truck was? Why instead move further down the dark path towards Trayvon Martin's house, incidentally? I don't know. It's a possibility, obviously, but the fact that Zimmerman neglected to mention this in his written statement and police interviews and made it sound as though he was knocked down immediately makes me doubt his story here. Zimmerman also undersells the distance down the path that he fell to the ground. He moves to about the location of this tree, but we can see from the image that Martin's body was actually found about another house length past the tree. Now, okay, it was dark and a traumatic experience, so I can't expect Zimmerman to be that accurate, But it is still worth pointing out that Zimmerman's account in this recorded walkthrough contradicts both his previous statements and the crime scene photographs. So why would Zimmerman lie here? He asked with mock sincerity. Well, obviously because he's trying to give himself the best possible justification for his actions. Zimmerman's account includes Martin being the first aggressor, which is very important, but also Martin explicitly telling Zimmerman that he was going to kill him and then reaching for Zimmerman's gun. And I mean, why not, right? If you're the only witness to a shooting you committed, you may as well make it airtight. I'm surprised he didn't have Trayvon Martin say, "I, Trayvon Martin, hereby pledge to kill you and will do so shortly. This therefore gives you the full legal justification to respond with lethal force in defense of your own life." I mean, why not? Now, the idea that Trayvon Martin would at first run away from Zimmerman and then see red and decide to double back and actually murder him strains belief somewhat. I mean, I don't believe Zimmerman chased down Martin intending to kill him in some racist rage, but nor do I believe that Trayvon Martin, while he was still on the phone to a friend, silently decided to double back and murder Zimmerman. So what do we think actually happened? Well, we're admittedly moving into the realm of speculation here. I do have a theory of what was probably the most likely version of events, and I'll give that here for whatever good it's worth. So Zimmerman isn't looking for a street sign, obviously, and nor is he intending to be where his truck currently is. We know that because of the end of Zimmerman's police call. So he's still poking about looking for Martin. He doesn't want this asshole to get away. Then him and Martin meet on the intersection behind the houses. Zimmerman's friend, who he was still on the phone with, testified in court that at this point Martin stated Zimmerman was still following him. So that backs up this theory of what Zimmerman was up to. So let's get into Zimmerman's mindset here. He thinks Martin is a dangerous criminal suspect. He's up to no good. He might be on drugs, and Zimmerman states he's got his hand in his waistband and later, something's wrong with him. He's got something in his hands, indicating he thinks Martin might be armed. So then, you're in a dark alley and you're confronted by who you suspect to be an armed and dangerous criminal who's on drugs. Now, what would you do in that situation? Well, Zimmerman claims he reached for his phone to dial 911. Now, I don't buy this at all. Excuse me, Mr. Dangerous Armed Criminal, could you hold still for a few minutes while I call the police on you right in front of you? No, that doesn't make any sense to me. What would make sense to me in this situation is someone reaching for their gun. Now, there's a few issues here. Firstly, Florida is a concealed carry state, and Zimmerman had a concealed carry permit. Open carry is generally banned. Now, if you're correct in your assessment of the person being a dangerous armed criminal, then of course you'd be in the right to reach for your gun to defend yourself. But if you later turned out to be wrong, and your dangerous armed criminal turned out to be an unarmed teenager walking home from the store, then you're fucked. Because drawing, reaching for, or flashing your gun would make you the aggressor and initiator of the physical confrontation, and then you're going to prison. So beyond my own estimation of what was the most likely series of events, what evidence do I have that Zimmerman reached for his gun? Well, nothing that would stand up in court, admittedly, but there is something else that leads me to believe that is what happened.
But he was about where you were.
Okay.
And I said, no, I don't have a problem. And I went to go grab my cell phone, but I left it in a different pocket. And I looked down in my pant pocket, and he said, you got a problem now. And then he was here, and he punched me in the face.
So Zimmerman here indicates that he tried to find his phone to call 911, but he had moved his phone to a different pocket, and looks down to his right side to indicate that's where he reached for it. And this is significant because this is also the area of his body where his gun was.
But that's when my jacket had moved up, and I had my firearm on my right side hip.
Now, according to Zimmerman, he had only just got off the phone with the non-emergency police line, so he had just put his phone away only a few moments ago according to his timeline, and now he suddenly can't remember where it is. So Zimmerman, when confronted by who he thinks is a dangerous armed criminal in a dark alley, coincidentally reaches to check for his phone in the right side pocket where his gun happens to be. I don't know, it is possible, but it's awfully convenient. And now you might be thinking, why would Zimmerman bother to lie about this? He's the only living witness to the start of the fight, so he can make up whatever story he likes. And the answer there is that Zimmerman, at this point, knew there was a witness to the incident, but didn't have any indication how much of the event they had actually been witness to. From Zimmerman's interview with the police on the night of the shooting, he says, "Then somebody comes out and I couldn't see. There was a flashlight in my head, so I asked if it was a police officer and he said no, it was a witness, but he was calling the police. And I said the police are on their way." So present in Zimmerman's mind during the police walkthrough is the existence of a witness who could have possibly seen any part of the event, which means he needs to account for his actions, including that of reaching for his gun. So that's why his phone goes missing only seconds after he put it away, and why he not so coincidentally reaches to that area of his body right before Martin hits him. So actually, Zimmerman, faced with what he incorrectly thought was a dangerous criminal, reached for his gun, and Trayvon Martin, chased down an alley by a stranger who then reached for his gun, defended himself. Is that what happened? Well, probably. We can't know for sure. There was actually no witness to the start of the fight, no CCTV footage, and that series of events, while likely, wouldn't stand up in court. I haven't proved anything there, and that's because it's impossible to prove. Zimmerman should never have been charged with something that it was impossible to prove in court. And I'd like to highlight something here in conclusion to this section. I just talked about the Trayvon Martin case without once descending into the ridiculous character assassinations that were rampant in the American media during the trial. Trayvon Martin smoked weed, the drug that notoriously makes people really angry and confrontational. Trayvon Martin posted a photograph of a gun on social media, and that's apparently more of an indication of violent tendencies than owning, carrying, and actually shooting someone with a gun. Now, this is the other tactic for justifying Zimmerman's actions, saying Trayvon was obviously a bad guy since he did X or Y, common teenage activity. And that's just disgusting and shameful behaviour, to be honest. Until the legal punishment for skipping school or smoking weed or whatever is the death penalty, people can stuff those sorts of justifications right up their back holes. So anyway, what I hope I have proved during that little analysis of the Trayvon Martin case is that there is no avenue whatsoever for laying blame upon Trayvon Martin. And again, in summary, any injury Zimmerman sustained could have been perfectly legally inflicted. Unless you have evidence that Trayvon Martin started the fight, Zimmerman's injuries are no justification. Trayvon Martin still being between the houses and not returning home is also no justification. Zimmerman also had no reason to be there, and even if Martin did confront Zimmerman, that doesn't prove who initiated the physical confrontation, which is the important thing. There is nothing you can accuse Martin of that is not also true of Zimmerman, and so the most pro-Zimmerman position I will accept as legitimate here is one of complete neutrality. The only logical explanation I have for explaining why people would actually openly justify Zimmerman's actions is because they are racially biased, whether consciously or not. Absolutely none of the evidence implicates Martin as doing anything illegal at any point other than the testimony of a man who has an enormous incentive to lie, and thus whose account cannot be trusted. If you favour Zimmerman's account of the incident, you are by process of elimination either a fool or racially biased. Now, I stated earlier that I could prove that a racial bias exists in the response to cases like this, and so let's take a look at that. And for this last section of the video, we need to know about the shooting of Lavoy Finicum. So, on January 2nd, 2016, an armed group led by Ammon Bundy of the 2014 Bundy standoff seized and occupied the National Wildlife Refuge in Harney County in Oregon. They did this for some stupid reason, whatever, it doesn't matter. On January 26th, 2 trucks carrying Ammon Bundy, Lavoy Finicum and others left the refuge to travel to a meeting in an adjacent county, and the FBI used this opportunity to intercept the trucks and arrest the group. One truck stopped, but the other, of which Lavoy Finicum was the driver, led the police on a high-speed chase, with Lavoy Finicum shouting that the only way the police could stop him was to shoot him. A mile down the road, Finicum's truck encountered an FBI roadblock where he crashed, left the truck armed with a gun and approached police who fatally shot him. Now, whatever you think about the legitimacy of the police shooting of Lavoy Finicum, the facts are that he was involved in an armed takeover and occupation of a government building, led the police on a high-speed chase, told the police he wouldn't stop until he was killed, and crashed his car at a police roadblock and then approached them armed with a gun. And it really is amazing what you have to do to get the police to shoot you if you're an older white guy in a cowboy hat. And all of this was recorded by both a police helicopter and camera footage from inside the truck. And I want to make clear here that I'm not celebrating or laughing about the man's death in any way, but it was entirely avoidable by him. For the other truck that stopped when the police asked, all occupants were arrested peacefully. Lavoy Finicum did not have to die, and it was clearly his own actions that brought about his shooting. So why am I telling you about this incident? Well, it serves as a very useful comparison to the shootings of various young black men, including Trayvon Martin, because thanks to the permanent record of the internet, it means that I get to do this. Keith Roadbush on Twitter says Finicum was simply murdered by scared cops who don't know how to handle it when someone else is armed and trained. Finicum never hurt anyone. For Trayvon Martin, however, Keith says, my solemn prayer is that Trayvon will serve to teach young black Americans the thug-like, gang-banging, stealing and dope-smoking life is futile. Holly Ammon on Twitter says, an innocent man was gunned. Lavoy Finicum did nothing wrong. These men, all of them, did nothing wrong. Yeah, other than occupy a federal building and lead the police on a high-speed chase, Holly. For Trayvon Martin, however, Holly says, Trayvon was just a big black thug. Blue Vino on Twitter says, it's kinda rude to forget that Lavoy Finicum was shot and killed while unarmed. In actuality, it's kinda rude to forget that he was really armed with a gun, Blue Vino. Anyway, for Trayvon Martin, Blue Vino says, the death was Trayvon's fault for attacking. Trayvon had no right to attack. Trayvon initiated violence. Waifu Kaori says, one confirmed dead, Lavoy Finicum. Hold these people accountable. Should we also hold George Zimmerman accountable, though? Apparently not. The hero George Zimmerman is going to donate money from his gun auction to fight the Black Lives Matter terrorists. What a great man. Ginger Merritt on Twitter says, Lavoy Finicum was murdered in cold blood, and then quotes a Bible passage. For Trayvon Martin, however, she says, God protected someone Trayvon Martin would have assaulted. So God works in mysterious and apparently racially biased ways, it seems. D. Claire Diane claims Lavoy Finicum was murdered in the first degree, but elsewhere states Trayvon Martin was a black thug. And it goes on, you get the point. And you can compare the shooting of the armed Lavoy Finicum to other shootings of unarmed black people, as it turns out. At Radical RW on Twitter says, Lavoy Finicum was murdered in the first degree. But for the case of Tamia Rice, the 12-year-old shot by police while playing in a park, they say, some idiot pulled a fake gun on a cop and got shot. What did he think would happen? Radical RW doesn't bother asking what Lavoy Finicum thought would happen when he ran a police roadblock, however. There can be no explanation for this obvious contradiction in reactions except for racial bias. When an armed white criminal is considered less dangerous than an unarmed black teenager, what other explanation could there possibly be? So don't be like these people, I guess is my point. Don't go for the easy excuse. Put some thought into your opinions and also consider why you hold those opinions that you do. Now, I intentionally called George Zimmerman white in the first minute of this video, and I did that for a reason. One point that was repeated constantly during the trial was that Zimmerman was not white. He's Hispanic, and therefore this isn't a white-black race thing, you know, which is pretty racist in itself, to be honest. But I called Zimmerman white because that is what he himself identifies as. He says he's white in the police interviews because, of course, Hispanic isn't a skin colour. You can have white Hispanic people and black Hispanic people and whatever else. Claiming Zimmerman to be Hispanic, not white, betrays an ignorance both of the facts of the case and of the relevant racial terminology. So I called Zimmerman white early on, deliberately, to trip up any YouTube commenters who don't listen to arguments and don't watch the whole video. So anyone who comments, Zimmerman was actually Hispanic, haha, you're wrong, beneath this video, I'm here preemptively shaming you. Thanks a lot for watching, everyone. Another day, another depressing video. I apologise. I have one about the British Empire in the works. I'm sure that's not going to be too cheery either. Maybe eventually I'll run out of darker topics and we can talk about something pleasant for a change. Wouldn't that be nice? Thanks as always to all my patrons scrolling by right now who enable me to keep making videos like this one. So if you want more videos like this, consider sending me $1 yourself, and also maybe check out the other creators that I personally support on Patreon, all of whom are very interesting folks who create awesome things and are definitely worth having a peek at. Also, follow me on Twitter and send me a Curious Cat question if you like. I try to answer at least some of them. Rightio, thanks folks, I'll see you soon.